There's a comment on one of the biggest Acolyte takedown videos on YouTube. Over 400 likes. The video it's attached to never once mentions Jar Jar Binks. Not in the title, not in the body of the review, not in the thumbnail, not in the outro. Somebody spent considerable time going through all 8 episodes of a Disney Plus Star Wars series and never found occasion to invoke the most mocked character in franchise history. Then, in the comments section, unprompted, requiring no prior context, somebody typed it. We all owe Jar Jar Binks an apology. 434 people agreed. The diversity of the Acolyte's cast isn't the argument and won't come up again. This is strictly about craft, motivation, consistency, premise, arc. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, opened on May 19, 1999. It introduced a computer-generated Gungan named Jar Jar Binks, voiced by Ahmed Best, and the cultural response was immediate and comprehensive. Critics disassembled him. Audiences found him not merely annoying, but actively offensive in the specific way only certain characters achieve, the way that makes you want the film to stop and restart without that particular creative decision included. The backlash didn't fade. It calcified into franchise mythology. For 25 years, Jar Jar Binks has been the default shorthand for everything that goes wrong when a filmmaker builds a character for children and produces something adults find genuinely unbearable. Ahmed Best spent years processing what it costs to be the face of a creative failure at that scale, a franchise that size, an audience that size. He has spoken publicly about the damage done to his mental health. In May 2024, the New York Times reported that Star Wars, The Acolyte, had a production budget of $180 million for 8 episodes, $22.5 million per episode. Financial filings submitted after the show's cancellation indicate the actual total expenditure exceeded $230 million, but $180 million is the figure that entered public discourse, and it's already enough to make the point. By the time The Acolyte completed its run and was canceled without a second season, the Star Wars internet had independently, organically, without prompting from any critic or review, concluded that the Gungan George Lucas created in a 1999 kids movie was a more coherently written character than anyone in this prestige production. That comparison is the thesis. Everything after this is the evidence. Leslie Headland earned the assignment. That matters for what comes next, because the failure of the Acolyte is more interesting than simple incompetence would be, and understanding why it failed requires understanding what she was actually capable of before she walked into a Star Wars writer's room. She directed Bachelorette in 2012, a dark female ensemble comedy adapted from her own stage play, starring Kirsten Dunst, Isla Fisher, Lizzie Kaplan, and Rebel Wilson. The film is built on women in conflict with themselves and each other in ways that feel specific rather than schematic. Each character has a distinct psychological profile, a distinct mode of self-destruction, and a distinct relationship to the central friendship that structures the group. These aren't interchangeable personalities assigned roles. They are recognizably different people who happen to be occupying the same story. In 2019, Leslie Headland co-created Russian Doll for Netflix alongside Natasha Lyonne. The time loop thriller became one of the genuinely praised artifacts of the prestige streaming era and earned Headland 2 Emmy Award nominations. Russian Doll demonstrates something specific and relevant. She understands how to build a character across multiple episodes with accumulating psychological consequence. The show's formal structure, the loop, the repetition, the incremental change, isn't decoration. It externalizes the internal process of a person who can't stop self-destructing until she understands why she's doing it. The mechanics serve the character. The structure exists to reveal a person, not to be admired in itself. That is a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between form and emotional meaning. It isn't a minor credential. Disney officially announced Leslie Headland as the Acolyte's creator and showrunner on May 4th, 2020. By the industry logic of the moment, the appointment made sense. The auteur-driven model had already produced The Mandalorian. Hand a visionary filmmaker with a legitimate critical record the keys and the budget and the canvas.
Leslie Headland articulated her vision clearly in pre-release interviews. She wanted to interrogate the Jedi Order as an institution, not as heroes, but as a power structure whose historical legitimacy could be questioned. She wanted to tell the story from the antagonist perspective, to examine what she called the duality of the Force beyond the franchise's traditional moral framing. Her central question for the series: what went wrong? What specific conditions allowed the Sith to survive in secret during the height of the Jedi Order's power? She described the show as fundamentally about the underdog versus institution dynamic, with the Jedi as the institution. These are genuine Star Wars questions with genuine dramatic potential. Andor answered a related version from the Rebel side. The Clone Wars spent years building toward interrogating Jedi institutional certainty. The instincts weren't the problem. What Leslie Headland added to those institutional instincts was a personal thematic investment that becomes unavoidably visible in the show's structure. The central drama of the Acolyte is organized around a coven of Force-using women on the planet Brendok, an isolated community of alternative spiritual practitioners living entirely outside the Jedi framework, led by a maternal figure whose authority exists in deliberate opposition to the dominant power structure. Headland described the show's engagement with gender and power as, in her own words, so wildly intentional. The preoccupation with female power structures, with communities persecuted by dominant institutions, with the moral cost of enforced conformity, these run through the show's DNA at every level. They are, in fact, its most consistently developed elements, more consistently developed than the characters who are supposed to embody them. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "A good novel tells us the truth about its hero, but a bad novel tells us the truth about its author." He wasn't being cruel, he was being diagnostic. When a story's internal logic breaks down, when characters behave in ways that serve a theme rather than their own established psychology, the audience stops watching fiction and starts watching the creator's preoccupations in costume. The Acolyte tells us that Leslie Headland is a thematically ambitious creator with genuine personal investment in stories about female power structures and institutional persecution. Those themes are more consistently present across 8 episodes than any single character's motivation. That imbalance isn't a small problem. It's the mechanism of the show's failure. And it's precisely why the fandom, searching for a comparison point, landed on Jar Jar Binks. Because Jar Jar represents the complete opposite of this failure mode. A character with zero thematic ambition, built from a single specific psychological observation that the story honors without deviation across 3 films and 6 years of production. The steelman for Jar Jar Binks has to be genuinely rigorous, not ironic, not a joke with a serious face on it. Rigorous, because the argument only functions if the affirmative case is strong enough that dismissing it requires more than a laugh. Start in a Naboo swamp. Episode 1, 1999. Jar Jar Binks is crouching in undergrowth near a forest road on Naboo, hiding from a multi-troop transport rolling past. He is scared and alone, and has been for some time. He was exiled from Otoh, the underwater Gungan city beneath Naboo's surface, for his repeated clumsiness. His own community, his own species, determined that he created more problems than his presence solved, and removed him. He didn't leave. He was cast out. He arrived in the swamp because there was nowhere else to go. The first thing that happens to Jar Jar is that Qui-Gon Jinn pulls him out of the path of that transport. Not an act of deliberate generosity. Qui-Gon is escaping, and Jar Jar is in the way. But Jar Jar's perspective on this is immediate and total. A stranger just saved his life. He announces that he owes Qui-Gon a life debt and insists on following him. Qui-Gon objects. It doesn't work. Jar Jar isn't performing gratitude to extract future benefit. There is no calculation here. He attaches, completely and non-negotiably, to the first authority figure who treated him with basic decency. Not through evaluation, not through choice,
but through the overwhelming relief of finally having somewhere to belong.
That is the character's entire psychological architecture, established in a single roadside exchange. Jar Jar Binks bonds to whoever shows him kindness, with a loyalty that is unconditional, non-transferable, and entirely indifferent to whether the object of that loyalty deserves it or is positioned to protect him. He bonds the way someone who has had community turned against them will bond to the first community that accepts them, not through assessment of merit, but through the sheer relief of acceptance after exile. Episode 1 deploys this flaw immediately and purposefully. Jar Jar accompanies the Jedi to Oto Gunga, the city that banished him, as their guide, using his one remaining social connection, the tenuous claim of having once lived there, to get Qui-Gon an audience with boss Ruger Nass. He walks back into the place that rejected him on behalf of people who accepted him. His clumsiness and social liability are transformed into assets. He's the only one who knows the underwater paths, the only one the Gungans recognize, the only one positioned to broker a conversation between two groups who would otherwise never cooperate. The exile's specific failure, his marginality, his incompetence, is the exact quality that makes him useful to the Jedi's mission. His flaw doesn't disappear when the story needs him to be effective. It coexists with his effectiveness, which is how actual character psychology works. At the Battle of Naboo, Jar Jar has helped secure the alliance between the Gungan Grand Army and Queen Padme Amidala that enables the defeat of the Trade Federation's droid forces. He isn't a decoration character. He is structurally load-bearing. His specific flaw, deployed in a specific context, produces a historically consequential outcome. During the battle itself, he's still clumsy, still stumbling into both disaster and accidental effectiveness, still completely himself. Episode 1 established the character's want, belonging, the psychological mechanism through which it operates, unconditional attachment to whoever shows him kindness, and the specific consequence of that mechanism. It makes him permanently available to anyone who understands his loyalty can be earned cheaply. Episode 2, 2002. Jar Jar Binks is the Gungan representative in the Galactic Senate. George Lucas made this decision knowing, with complete certainty, that Jar Jar Binks was the most despised figure in his franchise. The Episode 1 backlash wasn't ambiguous. He promoted the hated Gungan comic relief character to senator anyway, because the story required it. Not because the story required a senator. Any character could have been a senator. But because the story required this specific character's specific psychology to be positioned where it could operate at maximum scale. The Senate chamber on Coruscant is a vast, spherical auditorium of floating pod platforms, hundreds of delegations suspended in geometric formation around a central floating platform where the Supreme Chancellor presides. The scale is deliberate. This is meant to look like the administrative apparatus of a civilization, not a council meeting. Padme Amidala is in hiding, removed from Coruscant under Jedi protection. Jar Jar is her surrogate in her absence, the person she trusts enough to speak for Naboo in the Senate while she can't be there. The same mechanism that fired in the swamp fires here. Somebody showed Jar Jar genuine trust, and he will honor that as completely and unconditionally as he honored Qui-Gon's incidental rescue on the forest road. He stands up and proposes the motion granting emergency powers to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. The official StarWars.com description of this moment, a move that would have a profound impact on the Galactic Republic. That is the most deliberately understated sentence in the Star Wars marketing apparatus. What the emergency powers motion actually delivers is the democratic mechanism through which Sheev Palpatine consolidates dictatorial control over the Republic, the specific legislative act that makes the Galactic Empire possible. The primary villain of the entire Skywalker saga achieves his decisive political victory because Jar Jar Binks, loyal and naive and constitutionally incapable of questioning the motives of someone he trusts, stood up in the Senate chamber and made a speech. Why does Jar Jar do this? For the same reason he followed Qui-Gon into Oto Gunga. Padme trusted him enough to leave him her Senate seat, and he wants to honor that trust. and he doesn't have the political sophistication to see what's being assembled around him. The man who becomes the Emperor, the dominant architect of galactic evil across 6 films, achieves his decisive political breakthrough because a Gungan who was exiled for being clumsy wanted to prove worthy of the first queen who ever treated him as a legitimate representative. George Lucas filmed a scene for Episode 3 in which Palpatine explicitly thanks Jar Jar Binks for granting the emergency powers that enabled his takeover. That scene was deleted from the theatrical release of Revenge of the Sith. The on-screen payoff of the arc never reached general audiences in the theater. What did reach the theater was the cameo. Jar Jar in Episode 3. 2 lines, standing at state ceremonies in the republic he helped dismantle, present in the government he installed, surrounded by the architecture of the Galactic Empire without any understanding that he helped build it. The exile who spent his whole life wanting to belong now belongs to the furniture of an autocracy. The architecture holds even without the deleted scene. A Gungan was cast out of his community for being a liability. He attached unconditionally to the first authority figure who treated him decently. He honored that attachment by serving as the Senate proxy of a queen he admired. His service, offered with complete sincerity, handed the galaxy to a Sith Lord who understood exactly what loyal, naive people are for. 1 flaw, 3 films. Perfect consistency. No interview required to explain it. Now the prosecution. May is the primary antagonist of the Acolyte, twin sister of Osha, trained by a figure the show calls Chimere, on a mission to kill multiple Jedi Masters on behalf of a hidden master. 8 episodes. She is the reason the show exists. If the Acolyte works, May works. In Episode 2, May's handler Chimere reminds her of a standing order. Her master requires her to kill at least one of the targeted Jedi without using a weapon. This is presented as a reminder of an instruction given before the show's narrative begins. Leslie Headland explained the philosophical intent in a post-broadcast interview. It's trying to bait the Jedi into breaking their code, and if you can do that, then that's a stronger win. The rule isn't about unarmed combat in the conventional sense. It's about psychological and spiritual manipulation. May's ultimate victory, per the Master's design, isn't a body count, but a moral crisis inside the Order itself. She is supposed to be an operative who wins by corrupting her opponents rather than defeating them. That is genuinely compelling villain methodology. An assassin who succeeds not by killing, but by engineering her target's ethical failures, making them betray the principles that define them, is a sophisticated antagonist design with direct thematic relevance to a show about institutional moral blindness. If it had worked as a character premise, it would have been the Acolyte's philosophical spine. Episode 1. May is in a monastery. She has come for Jedi Master Indara. The confrontation begins as a test of patience, May announcing herself, Indara initially refusing to engage, the tension of a trained Jedi choosing not to fight a woman with a knife. Indara eventually draws her lightsaber. The fight begins. May produces a throwing knife and uses it to kill Jedi Master Indara. The no-weapon rule hasn't been stated for the audience yet. This is the premiere episode. The throwing knife is the instrument of May's first confirmed kill, and the audience's first impression of her methodology. When Episode 2 then formally establishes the rule, framed as a reminder of a standing order, implying it was always in effect, the audience is already holding visual evidence that May violated it in the previous episode, before the rule existed for them as a narrative fact. The structural sequence is unambiguous. Episode 1, Throwing Knife, Jedi Master Indara killed. Episode 2, Rule established as pre-existing, kill without a weapon. Within the show's own internal logic, the order was given before the story began. May violated it in Episode 1. The show introduces its protagonist's central operational constraint after demonstrating, on screen, that the protagonist has already broken it. Leslie Headland's explanation, offered in press after the season aired, May is so undisciplined, she always takes out the knives. That is a plausible character note. May's emotional inability to execute her master's directive, her desire for the kill overriding her discipline, could function as a meaningful flaw if the show dramatized it as a meaningful flaw. If the Master's reaction to her violations were depicted, if May acknowledged the lapse and its consequences, if the narrative built cumulative weight around her repeated failures to follow her own mission parameters, making her disciplinary failure a story engine rather than an interview footnote. None of this happens within the text of 8 episodes. The explanation exists in a post-broadcast press interview, not in the show that had every opportunity to dramatize it. Jar Jar's naivety doesn't require an interview to explain. Episode 1 establishes it in his second scene. The prequel trilogy demonstrates it in action across 3 consecutive films. The text carries its own explanation at every step, without external scaffolding from the creator. Episode 2. May visits Jedi Master Torben at a monastery, where he has spent years in a state of voluntary meditative stillness, sitting in penance, apparently choosing not to speak or move or participate in the world outside. His self-imposed paralysis has lasted long enough that other characters reference it as an established fact. May enters. She speaks to him. She has brought poison. She presents it. He accepts it voluntarily and ingests it, apparently willing to die at her hands. This method occupies genuinely ambiguous territory relative to the no-weapon rule. A character who induces a target to participate in their own death through psychological pressure rather than physical force is operating in a different register than a character who throws a knife. There is a reading in which the Torben method satisfies the spirit of the directive. The show doesn't offer that reading. The show doesn't address whether poison constitutes a weapon for the purposes of the standing order. No character comments on it. The Master doesn't appear to react to the method chosen. The show moves on to the next target. The audience is left to determine, without textual guidance, whether the second kill satisfied the first kill's violated premise or complicated it further. A coherent character premise pays its ambiguities through the text. When the show's own writer needs to be interviewed post-broadcast to clarify whether its central character's central constraint was followed or violated in the first 2 episodes, the premise is carrying structural weight the text wasn't built to support. By episode 6, the problem shifts from rule-following to motivation at the most fundamental level. Screen Rant published a piece specifically about this episode, titled, "I Have One Massive Problem with the Acolyte Episode 6. The documented problem, May impersonating her twin sister Osha, with what the review described as motivations amounting to a lack thereof. 6 episodes had accumulated before this scene. 6 episodes had the opportunity to establish, with emotional precision, what May believed about what happened on Brendok, how completely she had staked her identity on that belief, and what the Jedi's culpability meant to her at the level of lived conviction rather than plot summary. The pivotal impersonation in Episode 6 required all of that foundation to be in place and load-bearing before the scene could function. May's revenge arc is structured around a specific problem that ambitious revenge narratives always face. The motivation needs to be established firmly enough that complicating it later means something. The show is designed to reveal, in its later episodes, that May's understanding of what happened on Brendok is incomplete, that the events were more morally complex than her version of them, that the clean narrative of Jedi atrocity her entire identity rests on is more tangled than she knew. That complication, if it had worked, would have been devastating. Morally destabilizing revenge is one of the most powerful things a story can do to its protagonist. But the power of a fracture depends entirely on how firmly the certainty was built before it broke. The audience needs to feel May's belief about Brendok as something total and costly, needs to feel the weight of what she sacrificed to sustain it, what it cost her to maintain it across 20 years, before the complication of that belief can land as tragedy rather than plot mechanics. The foundation wasn't established at that emotional depth. May's certainty about what happened and who was responsible was never made specific enough, never made costly enough, never made personal enough at the level of felt experience to support the weight of the revelation bearing down on it. The fracture fell through floor that wasn't there. The direct comparison holds in its starkest form.
Jar Jar Binks has one psychological flaw, established in his first scene, consistently demonstrated across 3 films, escalating in consequence from a Naboo swamp to a Senate chamber to a 2-line cameo in The Ashes of the Republic. May has a stated operational constraint violated in Episode 1 before it's established in Episode 2, a revenge motivation whose foundation couldn't support its complication, and a pivotal late-season action whose reasoning a published critic found absent from the scene. One of these is a character. The other is a collection of story requirements with a character attached to them. Episode 3 of The Acolyte is titled Destiny. It takes the story 16 years backward to Brendok, the childhood that produced May and Osha, the Coven, Mother Anasaea, the origins of the twins, the event that set everything in motion. Every kill in episodes 1 and 2 pointed here. The audience has watched May eliminate Jedi Masters and has been told, in the architecture of the show, that her reasons trace back to something that happened when she was a child on this planet. Episode 3 is where those reasons are supposed to become something an audience can feel, rather than simply understand as backstory. What the episode reveals. Mother Anasaea, played by Jodie Turner-Smith, leads a coven of Force-sensitive women living in isolation on Brendok. Her partner, Mother Coral, is a Zabrak who serves as the coven's physical enforcer and Anasaea's counterpart in authority. May and Osha weren't born in any conventional sense. Anasaea and Coral created the twins through a Force ritual, using a vergence, a concentrated intensification of the Force at a specific location on Brendok, to bring them into existence. The Coven practices a Force tradition that exists entirely outside the Jedi framework. Their relationship to the Force is older, less codified, more collectively practiced than anything the Order recognizes or sanctions. Brendok itself matters. The Vergence appears to be the source of the planet's unusual vitality. The Coven didn't choose the planet randomly. Their home is built inside a Force anomaly, and that anomaly is inseparable from their identity as a community. The Jedi discover the Coven, Sol, Torben, and Indara among them, the same masters May is eliminating in the show's present, and begin evaluating whether the twins should be brought into Jedi training. Mother Anasaea's opposition is immediate. She didn't build this community in isolation, didn't create these children through Force ritual, didn't survive whatever sent them into hiding, to have the twins absorbed by the institution she deliberately chose to exist outside. The confrontation between the Coven's authority over May and Osha and the Jedi Order's institutional claim on Force-sensitive children is where Leslie Headland's entire thematic investment concentrates at once. Collider published a piece specifically about this episode, titled, "The Acolyte Finally Shows What the Witches Can Do." The expectation established by that title tells you what the episode needed to accomplish. It needed the audience to finally understand what this coven was, what their power looked like, why it mattered. The Force practices of Anasaea's group, their invocations, their collective rituals, their relationship to whatever aspect of the Force they access, needed to feel like a real alternative tradition with its own coherence. Not visual spectacle, a symbol to signal that something important is happening. An actual practice, with enough specificity that when the Jedi encounter it and misread it, the audience understands what was misread. Mother Anasaea, it's established, can transform herself into black smoke. When Sol witnesses this transformation, he kills her. The tragedy of the entire Brendok flashback rests on this moment. Anasaea's transformation reads to Sol as dark side manifestation, rather than as the expression of a different Force tradition. And his response to that misreading destroys everything May will spend 20 years trying to avenge. For that tragedy to function, 2 things need to be simultaneously true in the audience's experience. Sol's fear needs to be understandable. The audience needs to see how a Jedi who encountered that transformation could reasonably interpret it as threat. And Anasaea's transformation needs to be recognizable, based on what the episode has established about the Coven, as something other than what Sol interprets it as. The audience needs to hold both perspectives at once. To understand why the Jedi acted, and to feel what was lost when they did. That is, technically, among the most difficult asks a single episode can make of an audience, and it requires every prior scene in Episode 3 to have established the Coven and its practices with enough specific legibility that the smoke transformation reads as familiar Force expression rather than confirmed malevolence. The Force mythology Episode 3 introduces is ambitious. A virgins enabling the ritual creation of life. A coven with collective Force practices predating the Order's codification of what the Force is for. Twins created rather than born. Space.com noted, in coverage after the episode premiered, that the revelations about the Brendok witches raise significant questions about how the Force itself functions in this era. The ambition is visible throughout. The structural demand it makes on a single episode. Establish the mythology, establish the characters within it, establish the tragedy of their collision with the Jedi, make the audience feel it, is the kind of demand that requires every scene to work exactly as intended. Leslie Headland was attempting something that Russian Doll proves she is capable of, using formal structure to externalize internal experience, making a story's mechanics and its emotional meaning inseparable. The attempt in Episode 3 is genuine. The gap between what the episode is reaching for and what it delivers isn't a gap produced by indifference or laziness. It's the gap produced by a creator so invested in what she wants the scene to mean that the scene bends toward the meaning and away from the specific work required to earn it. Chesterton's diagnostic holds here not as an accusation, but as a technical explanation. The Brendok scenes know exactly what they want to feel like. They are less certain about how to make an audience feel it. The theme is present. The mechanics to deliver it are underbuilt. The cancellation produced a specific kind of retrospective clarity about the prequel trilogy, and the clarity runs further than Jar Jar Binks alone. Midichlorians, the prequel era in-universe explanation for Force sensitivity, introduced in Episode 1, that became the franchise's secondary candidate for most mocked creative decision, are at minimum a coherent idea. The decision to provide a biological mechanism for Force sensitivity is legitimately debatable as a creative choice. But the concept functions within the text. It proposes a mechanism, it creates a measurable fact about the galaxy, and it produces the specific narrative detail that Anakin Skywalker has the highest midichlorian count ever recorded. A concrete number that grounds his importance in something tangible rather than pure intuition. The midichlorians do a narrative job. You can argue George Lucas shouldn't have explained it. You can't argue the explanation fails to produce a consequence. The Acolyte introduces its own Force mythology. Virginces, the ritual creation of sentient life, a coven's collective practice drawing on a concentrated planetary anomaly. And the mythology functions primarily as backstory for a tragedy that doesn't fully land. The new concepts don't produce clear narrative consequences that justify their introduction. The midichlorians, whatever their aesthetic reputation, changed something specific and consequential about what we understood regarding Anakin Skywalker. The Brendok Vergence changes something specific about the origins of May and Osha, but the weight of that change collapses before it reaches the scenes designed to carry it. Anakin's "I don't like sand" dialogue from Episode 2 is the other primary candidate for the franchise's most graceless human moment. Wooden, expository, rhythmically inert in a way that makes actors visibly uncomfortable delivering it. The writing is genuinely poor, but the character motivation behind it's clear. Anakin experienced trauma at Tatooine. He associates the desert with loss and confinement, and the contrast he draws with Naboo's living surfaces is the emotional pretext for trying to get physically closer to Padme. The dialogue is bad. The character's reason for saying it's legible. An audience can wince at the execution while understanding exactly what is being attempted. That distinction between a scene executed badly and a scene that can't communicate what it is trying to communicate is increasingly the relevant one in Star Wars criticism, and it's increasingly generous to the prequel trilogy. The Acolyte completed its 8-episode run. Disney and Lucasfilm declined to greenlight a second season. The cancellation was confirmed. A show reported at $180 million, with actual expenditure reaching over $230 million, according to subsequent financial filings, didn't produce a second season. Leslie Headland gave interviews after the cancellation. She reportedly labeled YouTube Star Wars commentators fascists and racists while discussing why the show ended. She reportedly compared herself to George Lucas in a separate post-cancellation interview. Whether either characterization is accurate, neither statement represents an engagement with what, in craft terms, the show needed that it didn't get.
George Lucas, for reference, spent the years after Episode 1 absorbing the response to Jar Jar Binks, and then, in Episode 2, made that response structurally consequential. He put the franchise's most despised character in the most politically decisive moment in the prequel trilogy's narrative architecture. He built the character's failure directly into the next story. He didn't explain Jar Jar's psychology in a press tour. He dramatized it. The production gap between 1999 and 2024 is oceanic. Lucas was making a film on a new digital pipeline with a character that required unprecedented computer-generated performance capture. The comparison is, by any measure of production reality, absurd. The Acolyte had resources the prequel trilogy couldn't have imagined. $22.5 million per episode isn't a constraint. It's an instruction to solve every problem that money can solve. The problems the Acolyte couldn't solve weren't the problems money solves. They were the problems character consistency solves. And character consistency is free. There is a standard conclusion to this argument that writes itself quickly. Disney bad, franchise compromised, money wasted. The standard version is satisfying the way a scoreboard is satisfying. All the information present, none of the texture. The more honest version acknowledges that Leslie Headland made the Acolyte with genuine investment and genuine ambition. Russian Doll is evidence that she can execute at a high level. The failure of the Acolyte isn't a failure of intelligence or craft in isolation. It's the failure of a specific working mode, building a story around what you want to say, rather than building it around who you want to show saying it. The themes are clear. The people required to embody them aren't. Jar Jar Binks was built from a single specific observation about a type of person. The one who wants to belong so badly, they will serve whoever accepts them, without evaluation, without hesitation, without limit. George Lucas took that observation and let it run, film by film, until it produced the most politically consequential moment in the prequel trilogy's narrative architecture. He didn't need the character to be likable. He needed the character to be consistent. The consistency was enough. 25 years later, without any creative effort from anyone, to convert the most mocked character in franchise history into the benchmark by which a $180 million prestige production was found wanting. The exile who wanted to belong was always trying. Clumsy, earnest, constitutionally incapable of identifying when he was being used. Trying. The story knew what to do with his trying. It let the trying accumulate across 3 films, until the Gungan who bumbled through a swamp had bumbled the Republic into an empire, and was standing at a state ceremony in the government he installed, with 2 lines, understanding nothing. That is a complete character. We didn't have to love him. We didn't have to like him. The story only needed him to be himself consistently, and it was. We owe him the apology. The Acolyte just handed us the receipt. If you want more of this, subscribe.